Dae-Han Song is part of the International Strategy Center Secretariat and is in charge of the ISC networking team. He has organized for the Labor and Community Strategy Center and Bus Riders Union in LA and API Youth Promoting Advocacy and Leadership in Oakland. The International Strategy Center is a nonprofit organization rooted in Korea's social movements and reaching out to struggles, campaigns, movements, and experiments abroad. It is composed of organizers, researchers, translators, interpreters, students, professors, and political party activists in Korea and abroad. Their strategy is bringing and connecting the alternatives and struggles of those abroad to Korea's social movements, and vice versa. In our globalized world, exchange and solidarity between social movements is the only way we can strengthen our local and global movements to build a world beyond capitalism. Dae-Han, you can take it away.
Okay, my name is Dae-Han Song, and I'm in charge of the networking team for the International Strategy Center. And I'm honored to be among such esteemed activists and organizers. And thank you, DSA International Committee, for all your work in organizing such a space. And so my presentation today will focus on the Republic of Korea, aka South Korea. And I'd like to start with two photos. The photo on the left is basically the then chair of the ruling conservative party, Kim Moo-sung, and he's giving a piggyback ride to the commander of the Combined Forces Command. And this photo was taken July 2nd, 2015. So think of it something like the US Speaker of the House giving a piggyback ride to a foreign military commander, right? And the second photo is a protest in 2002 after the acquittal of 2 US soldiers that ran over and killed 2 middle school schoolgirls, which I'll go over in a bit later. So clearly the relationship is a complicated one. And to understand it, we must go back to South Korea's birth. Immediately after the Japanese surrender on August 15th, the very next day, grassroots people's committees for the preparation of Korea independence spread across the Korean peninsula. Peasants redistributed the land of the Japanese collaborators. Workers defended and took over factories. And on September 6th, a national gathering established the Korea's People's Republic. But on September 8th, the US military entered South Korea and established the US military government. On September 9th, I pulled down the Japanese flag and hoisted up not the Korean one, but the US one. The Korean peninsula was divided and North and South Korea were born. And this proclamation that established the US military government rejected the grassroots movements, the worker cooperatives, and the peasant redistribution of land. Basically, the US came not to liberate, but to occupy and to create a Korean government in its own image. Such a government would be established in the next 3 years, together with conservatives, many of whom had served the Japanese. Thus, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was born in 1948, followed soon after by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea. In the years leading to the Korean War, the left in South Korea was nearly wiped out. Tens of thousands of leftists that fought against Japanese occupation were killed, tossed down mine shafts, and buried en masse in the mountains. The Cold War birthed and baptized South Korea. The first period of Syngman Rhee lasted until 1961, followed by the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, all of them under the aegis of the United States. Yet if South Korea was born out of the Cold War, it was also shaped and grew up through its people's struggles. So to transition into the focus of my talk today, I wanted to give a few basic facts about the US forces in Korea, the USFK. Currently during war, it is a US general that controls both the US and South Korean militaries. There are about 28,500 US soldiers stationed in Korea. And the US forces in Korea is subsidized by the South Korean government annually. And in 2021, it subsidized it by $1 billion. And Camp Humphreys is the largest US military base outside the United States. What is the character of the US forces in Korea? Well, during the Cold War, it was much like an outpost against communism. Yet after the fall of the Soviet Union, as part of a larger shift consolidated after the 2001 September 11 World Trade Center attacks, the United States adopted strategic flexibility. This means that the US forces in Korea, while stationed in South Korea, they can be redeployed around the region. An important thing to note is that control of both South Korean and US militaries in Korea has always resided with the US general. In other words, the US government and not the Korean one controls the military in Korea during war. Attempts at transferring wartime operational control to South Korea have been repeated starting in 2007 when an agreement was reached, but the agreement being postponed twice by conservative presidents, and then finally the last president attempting it, but failing to, in particular because conservatives were able to collect 10 million signatures opposing the transfer of wartime control. What then has been the nature of people's struggles against the US forces in Korea? We can divide the struggle into two. Like one is around the struggle to amend the unequal military alliance, in particular on how it deals with the crimes and the pollutions of the US military. And more importantly, it's involved the struggle for peace and self-determination in the Korean Peninsula. The status of forces agreement, which basically determines how US soldiers and their dependents are treated in South Korea. It means that when US soldiers and their dependents commit crimes, they're tried not by South Korea, but by the US military. While there were countless unpunished crimes, the height of the struggle against these crimes happened in 2002, when two soldiers ran over two middle schools, and then they were found not guilty of negligent homicide. And that brings us to that photo that we saw at the beginning. Of course, this marked massive anti-American sentiment. Another ongoing struggle has been around the US responsibility for the pollution of its military bases. The US forces in Korea has abused the clause in the 1966 SOFA that stated that they could simply return military bases as they were. Later, protests would pressure the US forces in Korea to amend SOFA to address contamination that was known, imminent, and substantial endangerment. Of course, the problem becomes that all these are very vague words, and as they're vague, they're also very contestable. So today, less than 44% of the 40 kilometer square of vacated military bases have been returned. So as I mentioned before, South Korea shifted towards, the US forces in Korea shifted towards strategic flexibility, and as such, they started consolidating a lot of their military bases that were north of the Han River towards south of the Han River. And as these bases were closing down and transferring, they were leaving behind a lot of pollution. Many of them remain polluted ghost towns, and of the ones that have been returned, over half of them are polluted with oil, toxins, and heavy metals. As of 2017, South Korea spent $200 million cleaning up the vacated bases, and the US forces in Korea have paid nothing. Often the pollution is a result of neglected facilities, such as this oil tanker, right? It is much cheaper for the US to do nothing, rather to do nothing and then simply return polluted land that it's unaccountable for than to have to clean up and maintain its facilities. A FOIA request found that the US forces in Korea themselves acknowledged at least 84 instances of oil spills inside the Yongsan Army Garrison Base, which is the main military base, which was the main military base. There are seven instances of spills over 1,000 gallons and 32 instances of spills over 110 gallons. As regards to people's struggles of peace in the Korean Peninsula, they have recently taken various forms. In 2016, a struggle emerged against the creation of a THAAD base, which is supposed to defend South Korea from North Korean missiles, but it can't defend 50% of the population that resides in the Seoul metropolitan area. However, it can spy and map out China's missile system. So because of that, it puts South Korea in this awkward position between the United States and China. And the struggle still continues for completion. It still continues against the completion of construction. Starting 2011, villagers and allies also fought against the construction of a naval base for US and ally Aegis destroyers like battleships meant to secure nearby maritime commercial routes against China. If it's not clear by now, the Korean War hasn't ended. Since 1988, North Korea has pursued peace with the United States based on phased denuclearization in exchange for security assurances. And a major breakthrough was achieved on June 15, 2000 with the Sunshine Policy between South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and North Korean President Kim Jong-il. Since then, building inter-Korean peace has involved the strategy of increasing exchange, cooperation, reconciliation, and peace. Recently, Moon and Kim, South Korea's Moon Jae-in and North Korea's Kim Jong-un paved the way for a peace treaty, which Trump seemed to be willing to exploit to promote himself. Yet the process was ultimately derailed as the Trump administration committed the same mistake that countless US administrations have in not understanding North Korea's security concerns and demanding denuclearization in one step rather than a phased out approach. Finally, I wanted to briefly introduce our work. We seek to create solidarity and exchange between social movements in Korea and abroad by facilitating and carrying out exchange, joint solidarity, education, research, translation, and interpretation. And we're made up of foreigners and Koreans inside Korea and around the world. And yeah, please stay connected with us. You could subscribe to our newsletter through this link or connect with us in social media through these handles. Many of these struggles continue as part of a larger movements for peace. And here are two of the main ones. And we're also more than happy to connect and coordinate with these struggles as well. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.